Ayatul Kursi, a journey into faith, fear, and complete trust in Allah. There are times in a person's life when the world feels heavier than usual. The heart carries worries that cannot easily be explained, and the mind replays fears that refuse to remain quiet. In these moments, human beings realize how limited they truly are. Strength fades, certainty disappears, and control feels like an illusion. Islam does not deny this human weakness. Instead, it guides the believer to something greater than themselves. It guides them to Allah. And among the greatest reminders of Allah's power, mercy, and protection is Ayatul Kursi. Ayatul Kursi is not a verse meant only for memorization. It is a verse meant to be lived with, reflected upon, and returned to again and again, especially when fear, uncertainty, or exhaustion take over the heart. It is found in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 255, and the Messenger of Allah described it as the greatest verse in the entire Quran. This description alone should cause a believer to pause. Among thousands of verses, Allah chose this one to hold such a status. The greatness of Ayatul Kursi comes from what it teaches about Allah. It does not tell a story, give a command, or describe a law. It reveals reality. It tells the believer who Allah truly is, and when a person understands that, everything else in life begins to fall into its proper place. The verse opens with a declaration that defines Islam itself. Allah, there is no deity except Him. These words are not merely informational, they are transformational. They strip every false power of authority. They remind the believer that no matter how real fear feels, no matter how strong an enemy appears, and no matter how overwhelming a situation becomes, nothing and no one deserves reliance except Allah alone. Many of the anxieties people experience come from giving power to things that were never meant to hold it. Wealth, status, people, plans, and even fear itself become objects of reliance, knowing it or not. Ayatul Kursi immediately redirects the heart. It teaches the believer that true safety begins when reliance returns to its rightful place. Allah then describes Himself as Al-Hayy, the ever-living. Everything the human eye sees is temporary. People are born, they grow, they weaken, and they die. Relationships change, circumstances collapse, and even the strongest civilizations disappear. But Allah's life has no beginning and no end. He does not age, weaken, or fade. When the believer understands this, their heart begins to attach itself to something eternal instead of something fragile. Allah then calls Himself Al-Qayyum, the one who sustains all existence. This name carries immense weight. Every breath a person takes, every heartbeat in their chest, every moment they remain alive is only happening because Allah is sustaining it. The believer is not independent, even for a second. This realization does not create fear. It creates humility and security. It means the one sustaining you knows you completely and is capable of caring for you in every situation. The verse then states that neither drowsiness nor sleep overtakes Allah. This sentence alone has calmed the hearts of believers for centuries. Human beings need rest. Even those who promise protection cannot stay awake forever. But Allah never sleeps. He never becomes distracted. He never misses a moment. While the believer sleeps, unaware and vulnerable, Allah is fully aware of everything happening in the heavens and the earth. This is why the Prophet encouraged believers to remember Allah before sleep, placing their trust in the one who never rests. Allah then declares that everything in the heavens and everything on the earth belongs to Him. Ownership in Islam is not symbolic or temporary, Allah's ownership is complete and absolute. Nothing exists outside His control. Nothing is taken without His permission. Nothing is given except by His wisdom. When a believer asks Allah for help, they are asking the owner of all outcomes, not a limited being with limited resources. The verse continues by stating that no one can intercede with Allah except by His permission. This teaches believers sincerity. It removes false hope placed in people, status, or influence. Even the most honored servants of Allah act only by His will. This strengthens the believer's direct relationship with Allah, teaching them to turn to Him first and last. Allah then describes His knowledge in a way that humbles every human mind. He knows what is before His creation and what is behind them. He knows what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen. He knows the thoughts you suppress, the fears you hide, and the prayers you struggle to express. This knowledge is not cold or distant. It is perfect and complete. It means that when a believer raises their hands in supplication, they are speaking to one who already understands every detail of their situation. The verse reminds us that human beings cannot encompass Allah's knowledge except what He allows. This protects believers from arrogance and despair at the same time. It reminds them that understanding is a gift and that guidance comes only from Allah. Allah then describes His Kursi as extending over the heavens and the earth. The Prophet explained its vastness in a way that leaves the mind humbled. The heavens and the earth, as massive as they are insignificant compared to the greatness of Allah. This reminder shifts perspective. The problems that feel overwhelming suddenly appear smaller when placed next to the reality of Allah's power. Despite sustaining everything, Allah tells us that preserving creation does not tire Him. Fatigue is a sign of weakness, and Allah is free from weakness. He manages the universe effortlessly, without delay, without strain, and without error. The verse ends by declaring that Allah is the Most High and the Most Great. These names close Ayatul Kursi by returning the heart to awe and submission. Allah is above every limitation, every comparison, and every imperfection. Ayatul Kursi is not meant to stay on the tongue alone. It is meant to enter the heart. The Prophet ﷺ taught that whoever recites Ayatul Kursi before sleeping will be protected by Allah, and that no devil will approach them until morning. This protection is real, but it is rooted in remembrance and sincerity, not superstition. Those who make Ayatul Kursi part of their daily life often notice a change within themselves. Fear does not disappear, but it loses control. Worries still exist, but they no longer dominate the heart. Trust in Allah becomes stronger, and patience becomes easier. Ayatul Kursi does not promise a life free of hardship. Islam never makes such a claim. What it promises is that the believer is never alone in hardship. Allah is always present, always aware, and always capable of bringing ease when He wills. In moments of anxiety, Ayatul Kursi reminds the believer that Allah is awake. In moments of loneliness, it reminds them that Allah sees them. In moments of fear, it reminds them that no power exists outside Allah's control. In a world filled with noise, uncertainty, and false sources of security, Ayatul Kursi calls the believer back to truth. It teaches that real protection comes from knowing Allah, trusting Him, and returning to Him again and again. When a believer recites Ayatul Kursi with understanding, it becomes more than a verse. It becomes an anchor. It steadies the heart, grounds the soul, and reminds the believer that no matter how unstable the world feels, Allah remains unchanged, and that realization alone is enough to transform fear into trust, anxiety into patience, and weakness into reliance upon the Lord of the heavens and the earth. As believers move through life, one of the greatest challenges they face is not the enemy outside, but the unrest within. Doubt creeps in quietly. Fear grows when answers are delayed. Pain becomes heavier when it feels unseen. Ayatul Kursi speaks directly to these inner struggles. It does not deny hardship, but it redefines it. It teaches the believer that hardship exists under the control of Allah, not outside of it. When a person regularly reflects on Ayatul Kursi, their understanding of power begins to change. Power is no longer seen in wealth, influence, or control over others. Power is recognized in Allah's ability to sustain, protect, and guide without effort. This shift in understanding transforms how the believer responds to difficulties. Instead of panic, there is patience. Instead of despair, there is hope grounded in trust. The companions of the Prophet ﷺ lived in a world filled with uncertainty. They faced persecution, loss, hunger, and fear. Yet they were taught to strengthen their hearts through remembrance, not through illusion. Ayatul Kursi was part of this foundation. It reminded them that Allah's authority was not threatened by their circumstances. Even when the believers were weak in number, Allah remained Al-Qayyum, sustaining all existence. One of the greatest tests for the human heart is feeling unprotected. People fear being alone, abandoned, or forgotten. Ayatul Kursi addresses this fear directly. By reminding the believer that Allah never sleeps, the verse removes the idea that protection can ever truly disappear. Even when help is unseen, Allah's awareness is constant. This understanding changes how a believer views the night. Darkness no longer represents danger, but an opportunity for trust. When the believer lies down to sleep after reciting Ayatul Kursi, they are not placing their safety in locks, walls, or strength. They are placing it in Allah. This act of trust itself is an act of worship. Ayatul Kursi also reshapes how a believer views control. Human beings often suffer because they want control over outcomes they were never meant to manage. The verse reminds them that Allah owns the heavens and the earth. Control was never theirs to begin with. Letting go of false control allows the heart to breathe again. In moments of loss, Ayatul Kursi reminds the believer that ownership belongs to Allah. What is given can be taken, and what is taken was never truly owned. This does not remove grief, but it gives it meaning. It transforms pain into submission and sorrow into patience. The verse also teaches balance between hope and humility. Knowing that no one can intercede without Allah's permission prevents reliance on people, while knowing that Allah allows intercession reminds the believer of His mercy. This balance keeps the heart steady, neither arrogant nor hopeless. Ayatul Kursi strengthens faith by grounding it in knowledge. It does not appeal to blind belief, but to understanding. It explains who Allah is, how He manages creation, and why He alone deserves reliance. This clarity protects the believer from confusion and misguidance. Many people search for peace through distraction. They seek it in entertainment, success, or escape. Ayatul Kursi offers something deeper. It offers peace through certainty. Certainty that Allah knows. Certainty that Allah controls. Certainty that Allah sustains. This certainty does not remove responsibility. Islam never teaches passivity. The believer still strives, works, and makes effort, but Ayatul Kursi teaches them to separate effort from outcome. Effort belongs to the servant. Outcome belongs to Allah. When this understanding settles in the heart, anxiety begins to loosen its grip. The believer stops asking, "What if everything goes wrong?" and starts asking, "What does Allah want from me in this moment?" That shift alone changes how hardship is experienced. Ayatul Kursi also protects the believer from spiritual arrogance. Knowing that human beings cannot encompass Allah's knowledge keeps the heart humble. No matter how much a person learns, they remain dependent on Allah for guidance and understanding. This humility opens the door to sincere supplication. When the believer raises their hands, they do not come with entitlement, but with need. And Allah loves to be asked by those who recognize their dependence on Him. The description of the Kursi reminds the believer of scale. Problems that feel enormous exist within a creation that is already small compared to Allah's greatness. This does not make problems disappear, but it prevents them from overwhelming the heart. Allah's statement that preserving creation does not tire Him teaches believers something essential. Their needs are never a burden to Allah. Asking repeatedly does not exhaust Him. Turning back after mistakes does not annoy Him. Seeking help does not reduce His power. The names Al-Ali and Al-Azim close the verse by lifting the believer's gaze upward. They remind the heart that Allah is above every fear, every injustice, and every limitation. Nothing that oppresses the believer escapes His authority. Ayatul Kursi builds a believer who is emotionally strong without becoming hard-hearted. It teaches resilience without removing compassion. It creates trust without removing responsibility. For this reason, scholars have encouraged Muslims to keep Ayatul Kursi close to their daily lives, not as a ritual without meaning, but as a reminder with understanding. Reciting it regularly reinforces belief and reshapes perspective. Parents who teach Ayatul Kursi to their children give them more than words. They give them a framework for understanding safety, trust, and reliance on Allah. These lessons stay with a person long after childhood. In times of widespread fear, confusion, or instability, Ayatul Kursi becomes even more relevant. It anchors the believer when the world feels unpredictable. It reminds them that Allah's throne is not shaken by events on earth. Ultimately, Ayatul Kursi is a call to surrender. Not surrender to weakness, but surrender to truth. It teaches the believer that strength comes from knowing one's place before Allah. When recited with reflection, Ayatul Kursi slowly reshapes the heart. Fear becomes manageable, patience becomes possible, trust becomes natural. The believer who lives with Ayatul Kursi does not claim immunity from pain, but they carry certainty within it. They walk through life knowing that Allah is awake, aware, and in control. And that knowledge, when it truly settles in the heart, is more powerful than any fear the world can produce. There comes a point in every believer's journey when words are no longer enough. When explanations feel distant and reminders feel heavy, the heart seeks certainty more than answers. Ayatul Kursi meets the believer at that point. It does not argue with fear, it replaces it. It does not debate uncertainty, it dissolves it by returning the heart to what is real. A person who lives with Ayatul Kursi learns something subtle but powerful. They learn that peace does not come from knowing what will happen next, but from knowing who controls what happens next. This realization changes how the believer walks through the world. Life may still be unpredictable, but it is no longer meaningless or chaotic. When trials repeat themselves and relief feels delayed, Ayatul Kursi reminds the believer that Allah's wisdom is not rushed. Delay is not neglect. Silence is not absence. Allah's management of affairs operates beyond human impatience and limited vision. This understanding protects the believer from despair. Even when doors remain closed, the heart stays open to trust. Even when outcomes disappoint, faith remains intact. Ayatul Kursi teaches the believer to anchor their hope in Allah, not in circumstances. One of the greatest dangers to faith is the feeling of being forgotten. Ayatul Kursi destroys this illusion completely. How can a believer be forgotten when Allah never sleeps? How can they be unseen when Allah knows what is before them and what is behind them? This verse teaches the believer that Allah's care is constant, not conditional. It does not increase when life is easy or decrease when life is hard. Allah's attention does not fluctuate with human success or failure. This constancy is what gives the believer stability when everything else changes. Ayatul Kursi also trains the heart to submit without humiliation. Submission in Islam is not weakness, it is clarity. It is the recognition that the Creator knows more than the creation, and that surrendering to His will is the safest place the heart can rest. Over time, the believer who reflects on Ayatul Kursi begins to react differently to hardship. Panic is replaced with prayer. Complaints are replaced with patience. Fear is replaced with remembrance. This transformation does not happen overnight, but it happens inevitably when the heart repeatedly returns to Allah's words. Ayatul Kursi teaches the believer how to be strong without becoming arrogant, and how to be humble without becoming broken. It creates a balance that protects the heart from extremes. In moments of private pain, when no one else understands, Ayatul Kursi reminds the believer that Allah understands completely. In moments of public pressure, it reminds them that Allah's judgment matters more than the world's approval. This verse builds an inner refuge, a place the heart can retreat to when life becomes overwhelming, a place where the believer remembers that the one who sustains the universe is the same one sustaining them. Ayatul Kursi also prepares the believer for the ultimate return. It reminds them that this world is temporary, that ownership belongs to Allah, and that all affairs will ultimately be judged by Him. This awareness purifies intention and refines priorities. A believer who lives with Ayatul Kursi does not live carelessly. They live consciously. They understand that every moment is under Allah's watch and every action carries meaning. When the believer recites Ayatul Kursi regularly, it slowly reshapes their inner dialogue. Fearful thoughts lose authority. Negative assumptions lose credibility. Trust becomes the default response. This is why Ayatul Kursi remains relevant in every era, in every place, and in every situation. It speaks to the human condition at its core. Weakness, fear, uncertainty, and the search for safety are universal experiences. Ayatul Kursi responds to all of them with truth. It does not promise comfort without effort or ease without patience. It promises something far greater. It promises that Allah is with the believer in every state. When the believer stands in prayer, Ayatul Kursi reminds them who they are standing before. When they lie down to sleep, it reminds them who they are entrusting their soul to. When they wake up, it reminds them who gave them another day. In the end, Ayatul Kursi is not just recited, it is carried. It becomes part of how the believer sees the world, understands hardship, and defines safety. The one who lives with Ayatul Kursi walks through life knowing that Allah is awake when they are tired, strong when they are weak, and present when they feel alone. And that knowledge, when it settles deeply in the heart, is enough. Enough to keep going, enough to remain patient, enough to trust. Because the heart that knows Allah is never truly lost.